Happy lunchtime, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Souvenirs of Hungary radio program right here from your international smile on your radio dial, WKTL FM, right here from Struthers. And as I said before, our phone lines are open. Not today. We won't be open today because I have a special guest in the studio, and I'm going to introduce him to you in just a few seconds as I make a few alterations and get prepared for our next 90 minutes in the best in Hungarian music. And I apologize to all those callers that usually get in today, but I have a very important guest. He has a very important book, and I just want to get to the music and the story behind this because it's significantly historical in the way of us as Hungarians, Hungarian Americans, and the music that we all grew up with, Hungarian style. So, without further ado, I'm going to go with our first selection today, and I'd like to remind you that we're at 90.7 FM on your radio dial, digital or analog, so Ohio. And as I mentioned earlier in the show, we have a special guest. You may not know him directly, but many of you remember his dad, Julius Piskor. He was the bass player for the Frank Boris Orchestra, plus several other orchestras as well, but that is the most recent. He played with Rob Yoshko as well. Well, a labor of love has come about. It was released this past month, a book Steve wrote, 25 years in the making, called Gypsy Violins. And those of you that read William Penn magazine, my son Tibor Jr. and Tibor's Take in June wrote a short synopsis about the book. But the book is historically significant. Anybody that followed Hungarian music over the years will have a definite attachment to this book. Great pictures, great articles, great commentary. But, you know, I'm just here talking about it. I want to introduce Mr. Steve Piskor from the Cleveland, Ohio area, and he's going to tell us about a book, and then we're going to go through, because the book is filled with musicians galore, songs and music that we've played over the years, and you'll make a connection with you. And I just want to also tell you that Steve will be stopping by at Youngstown State University right after this program, and he'll be talking to you more on an individual basis. Maybe you have some questions about his book. And once again, his book is called Gypsy Violins. And, of course, at Youngstown State University today and tomorrow is the Fine Arts Festival. And, of course, all of you that go, you know that the Hungarian food is there, the Hungarian booth from the Youngstown American Hungarian Club, which is located on Donald Avenue. They have totot kapusta, cabbage and noodles, tort, Dobosh tort, just to name a few. Let's see, palachintas as well. I'm missing something, but that's okay. It's all great food. Stop on by and stop and listen to my son Ender play. He's playing the cymbal there today and tomorrow. But also, Steve will be there today. And stop by and say hi, and you'll find his book very, very interesting. So, Steve, take it away. Tell us about your book, the 5 W's, and we'll go from there. Thanks.
Hi, thanks for having me. It took me a long time. I first started out researching gypsies in general, and after a couple of years of researching, I finally started finding information about the Hungarian gypsies that were from the areas of Cleveland and Youngstown and Pittsburgh and Detroit, and basically they were all my relatives that were playing this music. And I had no idea that this kind of information was out there. We never saw it before. And the book actually is a documented history that goes back just a little over 100 years ago, and actually documents the whole entire time they were here in the United States, which is fascinating because it was documented where nobody knew that it was being documented. It was just from articles in newspapers and
but I guess what it was documented, but it wasn't put together. It was a little bit here, a little bit there. It was fragmented.
Yeah, it was in places where nobody knew it was at. From the Cleveland newspapers to the Pittsburgh newspapers to Youngstown newspapers to journals. There was 2 theses written from doctors, first doctor's theses written in the maybe in the early 30s. And not too much else about it, but there was small mentions in different various magazines and books and journals about these gypsies. So what I did was I got it all and put it all together to put it all in one place so you can actually see it from everybody's point of view in one book.
Now, this book is just loaded with newspaper articles and pictures. Do you have a lot more besides that, or is that pretty much what you got?
It's a lot of general history too of their culture, of how they did their weddings and how they did why their funerals were so extravagant to the means of music-wise. I mean, they lived by their music and they died by their music for hundreds of years. I mean, it goes all the way back in Hungary for hundreds of years.
Now, in your book, you talk that pretty much all the musicians that you're related to, and pretty much many of them that are in your book, came from Kassa, Hungary. Of course, it's now Slovakia.
Mm-hmm.
What made them come here? Why did they come to the United States?
It was basically the back and around the turn of the century, the steel mills were starting up in Pittsburgh and Youngstown and Cleveland. Andrew Carnegie was actually advertising for workers in papers throughout Europe, and that's why so many ethnic people immigrated to the Pittsburgh area. And Hungarian-Slovak Gypsies followed them because they knew that they were going to want their music too. So they basically followed the Hungarians to where they went to.
Now, is there a difference between the musical gypsies and the gypsies that say we so oftentimes associate with robberies and things like that?
Yeah, no, there's a 1,000,000% difference. These gypsies in this book were never fortune tellers. They never traveled in caravans. They never performed in a circus. They were not your stereotypical gypsies. They were basically musicians. They were stereotypical in gypsy music, and that's where the only stereotypical type that they had on them was the gypsy music.
Now, how far back do you know that the musicians from Kassa were playing gypsy music? How, you know?
Yeah, it goes, we traced it back into the 1700s, so it's at least over 200 years that we know of for sure. My grandfather talks in a newspaper article saying that his father and his grandfather were both cymbal players. My grandfather was born in 1890 in Hungary, so his grandfather would have been born probably in the 1830s, somewhere around there. So it roughly puts 200 years of cymbal players and gypsy musicians.
Now, so many of in the book, so many of the people, and male and female, were violinists and cymbal players. I guess that was the musical instrument of choice for a young person coming up. Then, you know.
Yeah, well, you know, if you go back to back into the early 1700s, what they say is Sinka Panna was the one that she was the one that was the first one that started the gypsy musicians as a cymbal player, a bass player, a second violin player, and a lead violin player. And she's the one first. They claim she's the first one that started that type of band.
So it was a lady then.
It was a lady. That's what.
See, and that's you know, we talk about equal rights. So all through this book, you mentioned female performers. This wasn't a male-dominated thing. There were many women that were stars over the years.
Actually, the Gypsy Countess Verona was probably one of the most well-known of the gypsies. She came from Hungary in the 1890s, and then she went back and she married a count of Hungary, and they ended up coming back to the United States, and the count's family disowned them because they were not so happy about the marriage of him marrying a gypsy. So the count actually settled here in Cleveland and started a business, but after that there's not too much. It kind of gets like foggy.
They kind of split up too, didn't they?
Yeah, it kind of gets foggy as to what happened between the two of them. We know she remarried a publisher and died under his name, which was Carl Robbins. But she played in all the venues, all the vaudeville venues around the country. She played in one of the biggest shows in New York, labeled The Big Show, actually, in the Hippodrome Theater in New York. She was very well famous.
And and all these things that we're talking about are all in the book, and we're just skimming it. I mean, there's close to 230 pages, so to speak, and
yeah, just almost 240.
I know myself, I've read it several times, and every time I pick up something new in the book, and I said, you almost got to, if you're only going to read it twice, first read the book from what Steve has written, and the second time go back to the newspaper articles and read it. It's interesting. It's I got to read it again. It's just fantastic, and it's really a labor of love. 25 years, right, to get this.
Yeah, probably more than that.
More than that.
Yeah.
But we're going to get to some music now. We're going to come back, and this first selection we're going to send out is Frank Boris and his Continental Gypsy Orchestra's most recent and last album that he released, followed by a Kitschy Hosbon, and we're going to send this one out to Rudy and Nancy Gall up there in Hiram, Ohio. They'll be dancing this song next Sunday when the Hungarians play for the Hungarian Big Dance, the summer dance by the Northeast Ohio Hungarian Cultural Center. The gates open at 12 o'clock noon. The Hungarians will be playing. But this is the Frank Boris song, and I think this is the only song, the Goya dance, that anybody ever recorded. Or maybe some other ones out there, but I don't have it. Frank Boris, and this has your dad on it playing bass. And I knew your dad personally. Tragically and sorrowfully, he passed away much too early.
Yeah.
And a few weeks before he passed away, he was at the Hoffer House playing with Joe Robb, and I talked to him then. And really a great guy, and he complimented Frank Boris's orchestra to a T. And how long did he play with Frank?
For several years. Actually, his last maybe 5 or 10 performances with him, I went with him because he was already too sick to carry the bass and stuff like that. So I went with him to make sure he was okay.
But isn't it amazing? I've seen this so many times with musicians. They're sick, and they get up on stage, and all of a sudden they look like they're 20 years younger, and there's not a care in the world. And that's the way your dad was, too.
That's all he wanted to do was play his music.
Yeah. I remember that last time I talked to him. I didn't know he was sick. He was, and he had that glisten in his eyes because that was the time that he told me, these gypsy musicians were from Slovakia. And I, whoa, I said, but of course it was the changing of the borders. But great guy. I'm glad I knew him personally. But we're going to go with Frank Boris, the Goya Dance for Rudy and Nancy Gall. You're in tune to the Souvenirs of Hungary radio program right here from WKTL FM in Struthers, Ohio. We're not taking phone calls today. I have a special guest in the studio at microphone 2. It's Steve Piskor. He's talking to us about a book, A Labor of Love, 25 years plus of putting together all the great gypsy musicians that have played right here in Youngstown. In fact, we're going to talk about that in a second. He dedicates in the book several pages to the Youngstown Gypsies. Now, the Youngstown Gypsies originally came from Casa, and most of them, did they settle straight here, or did they go somewhere else?
No, they came straight to Youngstown. They actually went to 3 different cities. They went to Braddock, Pennsylvania, Youngstown, and Cleveland, Ohio. And that was basically because of the steel mills. I mean, there was a big steel plant in Youngstown, too, at that time.
Now, being that we're in the Youngstown area, people are familiar with the streets. You mentioned that they settled about 1910 on Boardman Street, in which is now Youngstown's downtown area, what's left of it. And there were some very famous gypsy families that settled here. Ballogs and John Ziga, and who are the others? That
the Richko family. There was one famous one that played a lot of affairs, and if you check some of the old newspapers in Youngstown, you'll see his name. His name was Bela Balog, and we called him Bendy. I actually have him in the book, but the one thing I found of him was articles in newspapers of him playing in Youngstown area, of him playing for a lot of different affairs, a lot of picnics and stuff like that.
Now,
This was in the 1920s.
now, they pretty much moved out by when from the Youngstown area?
Yeah, I mean, the move in 1910, the 1920 census shows a lot of them in Cleveland already, and then by 1930 there was still a few left in Youngstown, but in the 30s they eventually all moved out.
And they went to other places, even.
Mostly Cleveland, first Cleveland and then Chicago.
And most of it was because of work. There was more work, you know.
Yeah, I mean, when you've got 100 musicians in one city, there can only be so many Hungarian places to play, you know.
But Youngstown wasn't the first. Wasn't it Homestead and Braddock that's where they first really came? And what year about?
Yeah, actually Cleveland was the first settlement. Cleveland shows the first settlement in 1887, and Braddock shows it in about 1888.
Okay. And
Braddock and Homestead was about the same era.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. There was an article in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette about a week ago. The last Hungarian club in Pittsburgh proper closed. They only had 35 members, and it's, you know, it's kind of, you know, symbolic of what's kind of going on with there. That's kind of the reason why I like the book so much, is because it's documented and it's been put together before it's lost. You know, and that's
the whole reason to put it together, is because today is gone. You know, there's nobody that knows it that's under 50 years old, whether you're a Gypsy or a Hungarian or anybody. I mean, nobody knows it at all. They don't remember them days.
Yeah, and that's what's kind of interesting, and the William Penn Association is kind of making a move for that. Is if you're a young person that's into the culture, you better promote them, because they're the last link before there's nothing, you know. And
yeah, it's important to preserve your culture, because if you don't do it, nobody else will.
You know, my son that writes in the William Penn, Tibor Jr., he has kind of a saying, and I don't know if he made it up or for somebody else, but he says, how are you going to know where you're going if you don't know where you've been? And, that's, you know, that's kind of, well, what it's at, you know.
That's kind of what I tell my people, because they lost so much of their heritage that there's actually no concern from them of actually bringing it back or even trying to bring it back. And I tell them, how do you know who you are if you don't know where you came from or how it started, or at least give your ancestors some credit for bringing you here.
Yeah. And going back to the Youngstown connection with this, Boardman Street and whatever, you mentioned the Bullogs and Richkos and Bundi Zerko. I think that's another name.
Zerko,
yeah. Now, where did they end up going after they left here? Did they mostly all go up to Cleveland, or they hit Detroit and stuff?
Actually, Detroit actually started in the 30s. It was it wasn't as big as Cleveland and Braddock. Youngstown was big, but because the people were moving so much back and forth to Braddock and Cleveland, it didn't stay as big. And it's because, like I say, there was more work for them, more in Braddock and Cleveland than in Youngstown. So eventually everybody moved out of Youngstown. I'd say in the 30s, because I know my grandfather was from Youngstown, and his father is actually buried here in Youngstown.
At Calvary Cemetery?
In the Calvary Cemetery, and he was buried in the early 1920s here. And my grandfather was born in Hungary, and when he first came here, he came to Youngstown, and then he married somebody from Cleveland. My grandmother was from Cleveland. She was actually born in Cleveland in 1896. So he was born about 1890 in Hungary, which at that time was Kasha, Hungary.
And you know, but which is also remarkable in itself, is that you know, the musicians are really going back. You know, we're not talking 56 or 48. We're talking in the 1800s. You know, there's several generations here that were born here. You know, it's
what a lot of people don't know is, like I said, my grandmother was born here in Cleveland, Ohio, in 1896, and her father came here in 1890, and her two sisters came in 1887. So they actually knew where they were coming at, because, like I say, they were following the ethnic people that where they were going.
And what's unique about it is they weren't coming to work in the steel mills. They were coming to entertain and perform for the workers that worked there. It's
Right.
you know,
Right.
it's an interesting.
They had their agenda set. They knew what they were doing.
Yeah, it's an interesting story. And like I say, we're only scratching the surface of this. It's you know, we could probably do 10 shows like this and still not cover everything. But we're going to go now to a fellow that is an accomplished musician. Of course, he's passed now. His name is John Brenkoch. And maybe tell us a little bit about him and from your book.
John Brenkoch was originally, he was born in Hungary, and he settled in Homestead, Pennsylvania, and then his family moved to Cleveland. And by the I'd say in the early teens to 1920, John Brenkoch Orchestra was probably the best-known orchestra, gypsy orchestra, in the United States. They made 8 records under the Columbia label and played just about every event across the country, every Hungarian event across the country. By 1930s, they were called to Detroit to open up the Hungarian Village restaurant in Detroit, where they stayed there for about a year and a half. Then in 1936, the Great Lakes World's Fair opened up in Cleveland for 2 years, and they called them back to Cleveland to open up the Great Lakes exposition here in Cleveland, which had a large Hungarian district in it.
Yeah, in fact, I have a program from it, a souvenir program, and I'm looking at all these little Hungarian kiosk, and music abounded.
Actually, they're in the official souvenir program. They're in the program. They're pictured in the program.
But
my grandfather was the cymbal player.
Oh, he was. Okay, yeah. So how many of your direct relatives were cymbal players? I think one of the females in the family was too.
Yeah, actually, on my father's side, the mother and the father was a cymbal player, and on my mother's side, the father was a cymbal player.
Wow. And that's something. But one now we're going to go to John Brenkoch, and down the road we're also going to have the Hungarian Community Bulletin Board, and I'd also like to say you're tuned to WKTL FM 90.7 in Struthers, Ohio, with the Souvenirs of Hungary radio program with special guest to the studio, author Steve Piskor from actually Brooklyn, Ohio, suburb of Cleveland, Ohio, and he just released a book, and the title of the book is Gypsy Violins, and he just released this back in June, a couple weeks ago. And if you would like to get a copy of this great book, we'll give you a phone number a little bit later where you can call him, but he'll be up at Youngstown State University, and he will be answering questions for you, and I know he'll have a few additions there as well. And also, I think it's is it at Amazon yet? No,
it should be soon, but the best place to go right now is gypsyviolins.com.
Okay, but gypsyviolins.com, that's your personal website for that. Barnes & Noble too, or no?
It's just being approved now. It has to go through an approval process.
Okay, a lot of bureaucratic red tape in writing a book. Something that you don't think about. It's just not writing a book. It's
actually they just approved 2 pictures on it because they said it wasn't 300 DPI. So I got a
Saturday right before us from 10:30 to noon, and also to Mike and Mark.
Originally from Braddock, Pennsylvania.
Originally from Braddock, and that's not his name. His name is Bela Ziggy, or Ziggy Bela.
His real name is Julius Margitza.
Okay, and really, besides his fame, doesn't he have some children that are famous as well?
Yeah, he's got quite a few in his family. His nephew is the famous jazz saxophone player Ricky Margitza, and his another nephew is the a famous violinist. He played with Andrew Lloyd Webber's Phantom of the Opera, and it's his there was 2 of them. One son played with the Detroit Symphony. He became the personal violin player for Motown Records. He's on almost all the records that have violins music on it for Motown, like Marvin Gaye. You actually see his name on the records. His name is Richard Margitza. So there's quite a few in his family that became famous.
And there's also an interesting story, too, about, was that your brother, or was that the group that, and I have it written down here again, and I'm trying to find it, too many questions and not enough time, down at the big nightclub in Cleveland, that was racially mixed, and...
Leo's Casino.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, Leo's Casino at that time was probably the best place, considered one of the best places in the country for... It started out as a jazz club, and with Motown coming out, it quickly turned to Motown music, and it was one of the best places in the country.
Who was there was the Piskors that were critiqued because they performed the night before that other group was there?
Yeah, that was my brothers. They started out, they were only about 16 years old when they played in Leo's Casino, and at that time they were doing Sly and the Family Stones, all of his music, and the night before they played, Sly and the Family Stones just happened to show up, and listened to them play that night, and he was just amazed by how well they played his music. And actually they were using his production name was Stone Flower, and they were using his production name, and he told them that they couldn't use the name anymore, that they had to change their name because that was his production name.
Oh, okay.
So then they changed it to a different name. I don't even remember what they changed it to at that time, but they played Leo's Casino 3 times, and that was quite an accomplishment for any group to play Leo's Casino, because you had people like Stevie Wonder and Diana Ross and all the biggest musicians playing there.
So there was so how long did they stay together as that group? You said they changed their names, but they...
Yeah, they changed the name over the years, but actually they stood together for quite a long time, probably 30 or 40 years.
Oh, wow. And played all around probably the tri-state area? And
Yeah, all through the Cleveland area, and I mean, they became quite well known, but with different names throughout the
changes, like so many of the groups do.
Yeah, I mean, well, they had to because of the era. I mean, you couldn't keep a Junior and the High Boys in the 1980s and 1990s with the disco era, so you had to change it.
Oh, wow. But so we're going to go now back to Ziggy Bela from Detroit, Michigan, and what was his name again?
Julius Margitza.
Okay, and he was quite popular up in the Detroit area, and I think he was a character too, quite.
Yeah, he was probably the best known gypsy musician in the country.
And he had the cymbalum players and
every year he did for about 20 years he did a gypsy picnic in Detroit, which became one of Detroit's most popular events.
So that was now. When did that take place?
He actually started that in the 50s, and it went until the 70s.
So that kind of mirrored the thing, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later in the show. The nights in Budapest in Cleveland, and there's
actually.
Hello, that concludes our Hungarian Community Bulletin Board, and once again our phone lines are not open today because of my important interview with Mr. Steve Piskor and his book Gypsy Violins, and we're kind of grazing through it, just hitting some things, but it's an interesting book. And we just finished with Bela Ziggy, and we're now going to talk about a fellow called Kalman Banyak, and he is you said he come over in 1956, Steve?
Yeah, he came when the Hungarian Revolution was going on. There was quite a few that came. Kalman Banyak, the cymbal player, Elmer Horvath. But Kalman Banyak, he settled in New York and was playing in a lot of the big places from New York, like the Waldorf Astoria and I forgot the name of the big place there. But eventually he came to Cleveland, and he stood in Cleveland for just a short time, and then he made his way to Las Vegas, where he went to work in Caesar's Palace Orchestra, and that's where he met Frank Sinatra. And he actually recorded several times with Frank Sinatra, and he is listed on some of his records.
And what ended up happening to him? Did he?
I know I have him in a book. I forgot what year he passed away, but he stood in Las Vegas, and eventually that's where he passed away at too.
And, but like so many of them, and really, you know, you didn't even know. You know,
most people didn't even know that he was playing in that with the in Las Vegas in that orchestra, and so many Hungarians were going there, and they didn't know that was him, and he made some of the greatest records that that are out today.
And you speak about orchestras and things. I was looking in one of the, going back to Homestead, Pennsylvania, there's a picture of if those old timers remember the Work Project Administration to help fight the Depression, there was a band that was, I think it was Homestead, or was it Braddock?
Braddock.
That was all made out of the Gypsy musicians.
Yeah, the WPA Orchestra became one of the most famous orchestras at that time in the country. There was 36 members of it, and the entire 36 members of it were all Gypsies.
Wow.
And other cities it was mixed. In Chicago there was only a 5-piece Gypsy band. In Cleveland there was only a few Gypsies, but in Braddock the entire WP orchestra was all Gypsy.
But and we'll lead up to this after we go with Margaret Bodnar and Kalman Banyak. We're going to talk about the connection. This is really interesting, is the connection of Henry Ford to Hungarian music. And maybe that's part of the reason why so many of the musicians went to Detroit, was because of maybe him. But we'll talk about that after this one. So listen in, and you're in tune to WKTL FM in Struthers, Ohio, 90.7 on your FM dial. So listen in. We've got about a little over half an hour left to go. I hope you're enjoying our interview with the author of Gypsy Violins, Steve Piskor. And once again, he will be here at Youngstown State University at the Hungarian booth, where my son Indra is playing the cymbalum, get some Hungarian stuffed cabbage, talk to Steve, and learn some stuff that is just simply amazing. I'm glad he chronicled this, because if he didn't do it, I don't know who would have. So let's go with Margaret Bodnar. And of course, her husband owned Bodnar's Funeral Home on Lorraine Avenue. And this is pretty much where a big Hungarian Gypsy orchestra enclave, kind of like what we're doing today. There's not enough time to hear even a quarter of the stories that you have to say. But once again, Margaret Bodnar and Kalman Banyak on an old B&F record. That's a story in itself. Yeah. Barb and Frank Saponyos. That was Margaret Bodnar, along with Kalman Banyak and his orchestra, and our special guest in the studio today, coming down from the Cleveland, Ohio area, the author of a newly published book, Gypsy Violins, a very significant historical document of how Hungarian music evolved and went here in the United States. It's interesting, and the side stories and just things like that. And we're now going to talk about a son and his dad, Sándor Jaraka and his son. And you talk about this in your book as well, Steve.
Yeah, Jaraka is probably one of the most famous of the Gypsy musicians in Europe. Actually, the 100-piece Budapest Gypsy Orchestra was formed from his funeral when he passed away. So they got the idea of forming the orchestra. And his son today, his son passed away a few years ago, and his son-in-law is Sándor Bufo-Rigo, who's the director of the orchestra today. And ironically, all three of them, when they came in the 70s to America, the first place they came to was in Cleveland, and they came to my house, all three of them. So it's just, it's not a coincidence that all of these guys, all of them knew each other. You know, my family was Gypsy musicians, and so were they. And they kept in touch with each other even up until today, with Robbie Lakatos. And Robbie Lakatos was here just maybe a couple of years ago.
Yeah, we saw each other there for briefly, you know. And
he went to Chicago, and his cymbalum player didn't have a cymbalum, so he actually called Alex Woodbury, and Alex Woodbury loaned him a cymbalum to play. So, I mean, we kept in close contact with each other for 100 years. It goes back all the way back to Mudjetty.
Wow.
Emery Mudjetty.
Wow. And, now Emery Mudjar had a son, too.
Yeah.
Now, which one was the one that died in the automobile accident? Was it the son or him?
It must have been the son.
Okay. But, that's one of the things, it's so tragic. So many of these musicians died early.
Yeah.
And I think what a lot of it is, you sit back and retrospectively, is that where did they play? In bars, and it was dark, and a lot of them, and the cigarette smoke and stuff, and
and then they didn't get off till 2 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
And
It's tough on the body, Yeah. When you're 22, it's not bad, but when you're 42, it starts to take its toll, But so we got Sándor Jaraka and his son, once again from a B&F record. You have to credit Barbara and Frank Suponius, because they were also kind of like your book. They kind of closed the gap on music, because if they weren't there with those recordings after the major labels, RCA and Columbia, dropped them like hotcakes, there was really nobody to make their
records. There was only the Hungarian label, a Qualitin label.
Yeah, and of course Qualitin was in Europe. These were here, and then with the Cold War and things like that, and so we got Sándor Jaraka and his son with another medley of great Hungarian csaradashes and songs. Sándor Jaraka and his son off an old B&F record way back in the 50s. And I was talking with Steve, author of Gypsy Violins, and we were talking about all the colorful people. One of the most colorful of all is a guy that had a fantastic restaurant. It was called the Gypsy Cellar on Buckeye Road, and he's almost an urban legend. Because one of the things was he would jump up on the tables and fill the wine glass, or actually the lady's slipper. She had a slipper with Hungarian wine, and he would drink it, and he would, play the music, and he was a character. And he used to play at the fabled and legendary Nights in Budapest. And maybe you ought to tell us a little bit about that, about Rob Yoshka and the Nights in Budapest, and his connection, because he's probably godfather to more gypsy kids than anybody.
He probably was. Yeah, the night in Budapest concert started in 57, I believe it was, and they went for 14 years. It became Cleveland's biggest society event. Joe Pasternak, which was MGM, I think he was with, and what was the other one? Joseph Vogel was MGM, and Joe Pasternak was a Hollywood producer, I think it was. And both of them were featured in the events. They were there every year, and they supplied all the movie stars to the event, which, there were so many movie stars that came to these events. It was a countless number every year for 14 years. And they featured, the night featured a full line of events, of singers, dancers, comedians, but the highlight of the evening was, the last part was the Gypsy Orchestra on it, and the orchestra featured gypsies from all the communities, from Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, and all the best musicians came to play for it. And like I say, Joe Rabb was one of the leaders, Ernie King, Frank Richko, Ziggy Bela, Maxie Franco,
And we got all these records here, we just don't have the time.
Just not the time to play them all. There's so many.
Maybe we'll have to do this again in the future. Continue this part 2. But Rob Yoshka, he, as I said before, he was a colorful guy, and we're gonna play a little selection from him. I think it's "I Adore the Women of Budapest," and in fact, we're gonna do a little ID with him, let him talk about our radio station, because way back when he did a plug for us, and even though he's long gone, I think he passed in '96. His memory's still here, just like with the book. Rob Yoshka.
Good morning, the twilight hour, the magic of twilight before the sun sets. This is your Gypsy Prince, Rob Yoshka, talking to you and telling you that you are listening to the very best in Magyar music. Magyar like from Budapest, with Terry and Tibor Check, those lovable people that I've had the privilege of playing for, singing to and loving them, drinking with them. They are at the Souvenir of Hungary radio show. You know that.